Next, Leap, an Iron March publication. I'm going to read the Methods and Morals chapter, which is about, I think it's made up of 4, maybe 5 articles, 16 pages long. So, starting with the first is Methods, Goals, Moralizing by Alexander Slavros. One of the key things that separate us from modern people, liberals and cultural Marxists, is how our values are actually positioned. In the modern world, people rely on an external point of reference for their beliefs and values, like an anchor, whereas a fascist's beliefs and values are ideally supposed to be embedded within, meaning that each fascist is the emanating source of his own values. He is fascism walking and talking. He acts with that inner core and decides for himself how to act in a given situation, whereas modern people are completely reliant on an external source to tell them right from wrong. I pointed out in the past how this may be the cause of PTSD, the clash between action and the external source of values. Being a passive subject to something external is prevalent to most anything relevant to the modern world, including spiritual views. Conversely, fascists are always proactive, thanks to the core of our beliefs being embedded within. What this means is that our values are more simple and direct. We do not have sins per se, but an understanding of what is true and what is false. We then judge a given situation based on that division and take whatever action is necessary to correct what is false and unjust. Modern people, on the other hand, are completely reliant on their external source, which thus means it has to be more specific and determine everything for them beforehand. Thus you get to the issue of morality and moralizing. In traditional teachings, morality is deemed merely a temporary tool to achieve a specific goal. In modern times, morality is to some extent a form of micromanagement, at least when compared to fascist values, to a point where one doesn't have to decide anything. Murder is wrong on principle, all of the time. That is how the modern mindset works. It's been handed a moral formula to uphold as a law. Humanism, being an essential additive in the mix, obviously helps push this note along. In the fascist mindset, murder is not moral or immoral. It is not right or wrong. It is simply a tool. Its use is determined by our inner core, and we are left to ourselves to decide its application. If murder is used to right a wrong, bring truth and destroy falsehoods, then it is just. If murder can lead to the opposite, then it is unjust. He capitalizes both just and unjust. But only in that case, since we can rewrite that injustice using murder as well. Yanks can parallel this with their long historical debate of gun ownership and the whole guns don't kill people, people kill people slogan, but only in broad strokes, and let's not get into the particulars of gun ownership as that's not relevant to the subject matter. I bring it up to better depict the basic principle in question. This is exactly why modern people have issues that come from not being able to reconcile an external reference point on which hinges their entire worldview with a scenario that takes place in the real world and defies their understanding. Soldiers killing and having PTSD was already mentioned as an example. Another great example of this would be the time Rockwell cornered some pacifist cunt with his hypothetical scenario of having to torture a terrorist to find the bombs that would otherwise kill thousands or millions, and showing the bitch that torturing him is a choice to torture one man, but not torturing him is making a choice to kill those thousands. So one way or another she is breaking her pacifist moralizing principles. Partially, the problem in question can be summed up in that cowardly golden rule formula of treat people as you would like to be treated. It appeals to cowardice, selfishness, and self-preservation. As I'd like to be treated? Well, I want to be treated really well because I like me. It already sets out your choices and actions for you, leaving out any actual proactive choice. The fascist version of this would be something different. Expect others to treat you as you had or would treat them. This means two things. You are given the right to decide how you treat others and thus maintain proactive choice and decision-making based on our core values, and it tells you how others may react to your action. If you set out to kill someone, expect them to try and kill you. If you set out to help someone, you can expect some kindness from them. It may not be anything big or even relatively proportionate to the kindness you offer them, but you know where they stand with you at that junction. The reason I bring all of this up is that we do not always operate according to this rule. We still fall back to some aspects of modern thinking because we've been born into this world, and inevitably a lot of this stuff sticks at the most basic level, and we can't always shake it, because it has to be brought to the surface of our conscious thinking. Otherwise it's hidden in the background and we don't realize how it affects us. Everyone who whines about white genocide are the result of this issue. Everyone who whines Africa for Africans, but white countries for everyone, are the results of this issue. Everyone who whines about Dresden, Holodomor, communist repressions are the result of this issue. Everyone who started denouncing Breivik for having killed Norwegian teens and thus acting in contradiction to nationalist aims are the result of this issue. Well, this tendency is often found in those guilty of trying to be moderate. However, the issue at hand is also seen in those who do not hide and pretend to be moderate. Why? Because they start moralizing. If you support genocide as a tool, a method for achieving a goal, you can't bitch about someone else using it, even if it's against yourself. If you support using labor camps, then you can't bitch about someone else using them. If you support violence as a method, you can't bitch about others using it. Because whenever that is brought up, it is brought up in a manner that is typical for modern people and their bleeding hearts and morals and victim complex thinking. It comes off as you being a hypocrite because you make it sound like it is a bad thing on principle. This can be explained partially in a need of such whining as a propaganda tool for the more simple-minded masses, especially so if that's how they operate. But if you yourself believe that and use it in all honesty as an argument, then you really are a hypocrite. Would we not create a temporary repressive system in order to root our elements we deem dangerous to the establishment of a society that we desire? We would, because then we are advancing truth and justice. Should we oppose a repressive system that is created to keep at bay anyone who would try to dismantle the reign of falsehoods and injustice? Not only should we must. What we do not oppose, however, are the methods. We oppose the goals. Opposing methods is rooted in moralizing and boils down to, no fair, you can't do that, only I can do that, or liberal-like tears over something that you're supposed to expect from the enemy. We came about to this point in our discussion with Sammy from how we both came to question liberal propaganda from different angles. I started off as a commie, and looking into debunking anti-Stalinist claims on repression gave me, ironically, a window for questioning what was said about nationalism, fascism, and the Holocaust, whereas he started off with nationalism, fascism, and the Holocaust, and that gave him a window for questioning what was said about Stalin's regime. We boiled down this particular example of the bigger problem in question here in this basic criticism of many nationalists/fascists out there. Oh, those fucking liberals and kikes lie and lie and lie about Hitler and the Holocaust, but their info on Stalin is 100% solid accurate. Or take the Pavlik-Morozov story, the propaganda version of it. We won't go into the authenticity of it and the research conducted to see how much of it is true, because we just want to argue the popularized propaganda premise and not what really happened. We'll boil down the propaganda story to this basic note. Dedicated commie kid sells out his parent to the state for being an anti-commie. This story is rarely brought up to arguments on the evils of communism, but it happens, and some nationalists make a point how awful this is because it fucks up family values. Well then here's a question. In the early years after we take power and try to root out all elements that would hinder the establishment of a fascist society, would we shun a kid who reported on his parents for assisting such elements? Is he a hero to our views and values, or an example of how fascism is evil because this fucks up family values? The Breivik example depicts another clear aspect that we've all long since come a consensus to, and it is closely related to one of our core views that together come in direct opposition to the modern thinking mentioned prior. We don't think murder is wrong on principle, and we do not believe that every human life is sacred. This applies to our own people as well. Just because they are kin by blood doesn't mean they can't be cancer to the nation which must be removed in order for truth and justice to triumph. So Breivik is a hero, but a kid who'd betray degenerate parents isn't? There is another aspect to this. We adopted our methods from the enemy. Mussolini learned from Lenin. Hitler learned from the commies he fought against, fighting fire with fire. The issue here is that communism was the natural product of how history and thinking had developed. It is a product of the time and thus was the most in tune with the temporal reality. It was a force in time. Our ideals are timeless, but our methods change depending on the time we live in because we are a force against time. and the best way to keep up is to analyze and adapt the methods of the force in time that is most in tune with that era. Because methods are not moral or immoral on principle for all times, like the modern mindset would think, they are just a weapon or tool to be used. We come here to the whole Machiavellian argument of goals justifying the means. However, one author, wish I could remember his name, I read his analysis of Machiavelli for a paper I had to write, rightfully made a clarifying point. Great goals justify any means. Funny enough, modern people like to criticize Machiavelli, but use the goals justify means formula themselves, just not in the most overt way and using other terms. In fact, that principle works best wherever money is the goal. Goals determine if some action is just or unjust, not on principle, but in application for the achievement of that goal. So great goals justify actions as just, petty and false goals render actions as unjust. The modern mindset is the one that whines about violence on principle. It will cry about the awful methods and mistreatment of people regardless of who they are. It will play up the victim complex to high heaven and try to appeal to self-interest by asking everyone to treat others as they themselves want to be treated. Funny enough, they do it out of self-interest as well. This is the mindset of a coward trying to avoid the battlefield. Our mindset is the one that is more principled and stoic in regards to these things. We don't cry about the awful methods if we'd used those methods ourselves, and we discriminate who deserves what sort of treatment. We don't whine when the enemy hits us, and we don't lament over how inhuman or bad it was. We strike back with the same force or greater if necessary. This is the mindset of a warrior on the battlefield. Getting hit by a sword is no point of argument that the guy wielding it is a meanie. Likewise, bombing of Dresden is no point of argument that the Allies were meanies. It can have a place in propaganda when appealing to the modern mindset to confuse it or make it face that inconsistency with its core values, but it is inexcusable to actually believe your own propaganda in this instance when you're supposed to have a different attitude to the issue at the core. There is no place for whining, and going into victim complex mode means stooping down to the level of that coward who wants to avoid the battlefield and live a comfy, hedonistic life. The liberal whining of so-and-so gets our rightful reaction of, so what? But some play that card themselves and expect to be given a different answer. Wrong. White genocide. So what? Stop whining and being surprised that the enemy is trying to wipe you out. Don't appeal to his self-interest out of your own self-interest and just fucking hit back already. Stop whining and pointing to Stalin if you wouldn't do anything different for our goals. Don't be the guy that condemns Breivik for killing his own people by being the guy who cries about Pavlik ratting out his parents, because both come from the same mindset. Rely on the internal core. Decide what is true or false. Choose the method to reach the goal. Don't moralize it, and don't moralize any of the resisting force you experience on your way to that goal. Push comes to shove, so expect it, and if you fall down, pick yourself back up and keep on pushing, rather than crying, "He shoved me, wah," because no one is listening, certainly not the enemy. This is our edge over them. We don't cry about any of it, so keep it sharp and don't waver. Don't ever whine about anything, even if it were done to you. Expect it. Next article. Destroy, Rebuild, Redefine by Alexander Slavros. This is something that I gave some thought after a conversation with Benjamin a while back. I've originally presented futurism as the only valid direction for American fascism, and more recently I talked about it as a particular direction of Nazi passion. In the case of USA, the American Futurism Workshop says it all. There is nothing to work with, nothing to rely on. Bring it down, wipe the slate clean, and let something organic grow from the ashes. In the context of involution and the cyclical vision of history, the worse things get and the more we lose, the more free we are to act out in more extreme ways. If there's nothing to defend, all you can do is attack. We as fascists with real national, cultural, and ethnic backgrounds to rely on do hold on to our respective national cultures and civilizations and ultimately would like to see them survive into the next cycle. In fact, it's one of the pillar reasons for our struggle, among which are also the defense of race and racial purity for both biological and spiritual reasons that are inevitably intertwined. as well as being champions of truth who are in a hurry to usher in the next revival. But the more curtains draw to a close, and if our progress is little, we'll inevitably act out more as the decay will start tearing away at cultures and civilizations first, then race, and finally, that will in and of itself affect how much truth will truly be allowed to shine in the next cycle. The less time we'll have, the more reckless we are free to be. I mentioned how upholding truth on all levels is important, from personal to national, to civilization and racial and so on. In serving our nation and its truth, we serve the ultimate truth, and the same applies to race and other aspects. I also spoke about the danger of confusing temporal politics and history for the worldview itself. With all of that in mind, one has to ask, how much of our civilizations are we truly supposed to preserve? As we established, history and temporal matters are not what make up our worldview, for it is something immaterial and thus timeless. Everything of this world is subject to change and decay, so if we follow that understanding here, then what I'm saying is that we cannot confuse passing on bricks of a temple for passing on the sacred flame that was lit in it. National truth is just as immaterial, but the nation is its material manifest. This goes back to my first reading, Ustryalov, Ustrylov, which predates my Ebola studies, Ustryalov, when he wrote of how patriots of the Russian Empire mistook fighting for its particular historic manifestation for the struggle to save Russia herself, when she was in fact alive and well but moving on. Quote, "And Russia, dissolved in spaces, rises again from spaces, in a new visage, a new dress, and bad are those patriots who do not recognize her in it. It means they only honored her with their lips but not their hearts. It means they only honored her facade and not her substance." End of quote. The crucial message of this quote, if put in the language of my recent topics, is that national truth is also immaterial and not tied to buildings and aesthetics, flags and memorials. It is immaterial and thus may live on in a different material manifestation. Quote, "Does the red banner desecrate the Winter Palace? Or to the contrary, does the Winter Palace glorify the red banner? Does the Internationale desecrate with unholy sound the Spassky Gates? Or do the Spassky Gates give new meaning to the Internationale with wind, Kremlin's breath?" End of quote. While the quote uses exclusively material examples, it does get the point across of how the spirit may live on. The flame is passed on. Let's not go into the particular example of Ustryalov's views on Bolshevism as I had voiced it before, and if need be, that topic may get its own elaboration later. Here we focus on the big picture. When we apply this topic to the matter of race, we are looking at the matter of purification and molding of a new man, the goal of the originally intended Italian fascist racial doctrine. What I am getting at is how we cannot be afraid of breaking ties with the past. What we call the past is based on relative perception of time. Relative to our lives, so many things are the past, but the more recent we come to our own time in history, the less of truth we see, and more importantly, regardless of how distant or near that past is, it is all of the material world. What truly matters, our worldview, is timeless. It is not hidden in the past, it is not absent in the present, it is not shining in the future, it simply is. Always. The real question is how much of it holds grasp on the material world, but that is where the confusion comes from. Law of materiality is changeability. It has to change, but we often mistake what is temporal, material, historic for something that supposedly will always be the only manifest of our worldview, which they cannot be by definition. And while we subscribe to cyclical vision of history and thus expect some things to recur, it can only happen in its place and time. It cannot be forced. People who wish to restore monarchies for whatever reason, worst of all those who think that restoring a monarchy would bring back some ideal state from a historic past with its particular aesthetics and flavor copied perfectly, are trying to force something that cannot be forced. Monarchies may come again, but only if temporal laws allow it. And even if they were forced, they would be irrelevant and doomed in a time that is not theirs. Hence, why still existing monarchies are irrelevant completely. Not just to temporal matters, but to our worldview. Maybe at some point further back it still held some reason for a fascist to defend the monarchy as many did, but today this defense holds no validity to us. Fascist Italy and Nazi Germany respectively looked to the past and were held down by some temporal politics that held them back, but there was more reason to it, and they had in effect built something like a bridge between the old manifest of our worldview and the new. Today we may have less room still for the past, and tomorrow it may entirely fall to the wayside. I laid out how the man above time had already won because he is a walking, living manifest of our worldview. In him are combined all truths that make up the ultimate truth. He has no ties to hold him down, be they material, temporal, or anything else. He doesn't need a material temple for the flame of truth. He is that temple. He doesn't really need the nation. He is the nation. He doesn't really need race. He is race. Those things cannot be taken away from him because they are crystallized within the self that has come in touch with the ultimate truth. In the Mithraic mysteries, which are another one of many depictions of the right-hand path to transcendence, quote, Mithras becomes the bearer of the sovereign power of the sun, end quote, the sun being the ultimate truth. The point here is to once again impart what is truly at the very core of our views, which is once again not to say that our struggle is in some way belittled or that nation, culture, civilization, and race don't matter. They do, but only insofar as they are manifestations of the truth in their respective lesser truths. Likewise, it doesn't mean we can't honor great men of our history, but we have to be more critical of some men of the past, just as we are critical of our folk in the present. What it all really means is that we must not be held back or bound by temporal, material manifests of the truth which no longer serve that purpose. It also does not mean that we cannot rebuild on those ruins, but we do have more options. We are allowed to be a creative force for what is the true essence of our struggle, truth. As much as we can restore some of the past and give it new life, we can also tear it down and mold something new in the temporal sense of the word. Futurism is not an exclusively American option. It is simply easier applied there, as the U.S. never had anything in its foundation and at no point manifested even for a moment that truth. While we will be more and more free to act, more radical and futurist, the closer we come to the abyss with less things to protect. That situation would simply be a result of us being left no other options. But we can choose to act as radical now as we would be in that situation, and may come out actually saving more than we would be carrying the bricks of the past with us. In the spoiler below, there are a couple of messages from Benjamin. I asked him to think back to our original conversation that happened a while ago, so that I could better articulate my point by reflecting on the points he made. So I'm including his perspective as part of this topic for your consideration on the subject matter. So here's the comment. There is a political aspect to it. The past lives in institutions that were created in the past, and you have to relate yourself to them in some way. Use them, be used by them, destroy them, tolerate them. You take a position. The church, the army, the government, the services, and a moral institution like patriotism, reflex, loyalty. As it relates to all of them, all of these are independent actors. These are all adopted by the modern world. This is important because when we are talking about the past in the debate, as you have raised it, Romans, Vikings, Napoleon, even the communists are to me pre-modern. History only applies to things that exist today because people on the right look to them in search of the agency on which they were founded. Someone wanting to restore the institution of monarchy because he thinks it will bring that past into the present doesn't condemn what that meant at the time. Instead, it is the institution. Fascism as a movement aims to establish an institution for engaging with these other actors, but the presupposition is that aside from the enemy, it alone has agency. It has a historical life spirit on which a world can be built or renewed, kind of like your involution cycle. Start again or start anew. Almost the same. Depends on what you think the debate is. For instance, is it debating the merits of different right-wing ideologies for being politically effective? Or whether, when we restart, we do so with the trimmings, some of the trimmings, or reinvention? The latter can really only happen organically. We should be prepared to scrutinize everything. Why ring-fence it? Is there such a thing as being too radical? In my opinion, we are at a point where institutions have come near to the end of their lives, and we absolutely cannot depend on them, not even to form a negative opinion. There is almost no point in attacking something like Christianity more than it is actually relevant, which it isn't. There is a part in Volume 2 of Mein Kampf where he discusses the basis of the new party and its authority, explaining why authority based on tradition is irrelevant and how the revolution has opened up possibilities. End of comment. I'll finish the topic in a little Ustryalov-style twist. In the Russian version of the Internationale, there is a line that translates into English as, "We'll create a new world of our own." I just happen to like the way it is phrased in Russian more than the original French/English version of, "The world is about to change its foundation," as it doesn't really work with the point I wish to convey. That's in parentheses. Can we really say that this is not our goal as well? And then again, there is a Russian saying, "Everything new is the well-forgotten old." The Titan and the hero are formed from the same matter. And that ends that article. The next one is titled Anarchy and Totalitarianism by Alexander Slavros. This is just a new narrative I've mulled over to further drive the point home on several aspects presented in previous articles. If you have noticed, we already had gone over fascism's relationship with anarchy and totalitarianism, but this will be the first time that I directly put them side by side to shine more light on the subject of fascist means to establish a temporal society of truth. In a way, this is the definitive way to designate the difference between the two subgroups relevant to what I defined as Nazi passion, which is an overt force against time struggle. One of those subgroups I didn't give any name as such, while the other one I designated as futurism. Now I introduce a simpler way of looking at these two subgroups by directly associating them with anarchy and totalitarianism. Neither anarchy nor totalitarianism are our end goals, but they are a means to an end. Futurism, the path to a fascist society through anarchy, demands the annihilation of the existing temporal social order and its institutions in order to start from scratch so that a more organic rebirth may occur straight through all the natural and organic processes. The other path to a fascist society, through totalitarianism, means utilizing the mechanical state Leviathan in order to create a protective outer shell that would fall away once a new generation has been grown that would by default act according to what was previously enforced by mechanical means of total control. This method neither implies the need to destroy all existing aspects of social order or its institutions, but neither does it call for trying to infiltrate the system. It simply means a social revolution in the common sense of that concept. This is what happened in Italy, Germany, and Russia. We're talking about the process here, not who or for what purpose did it. All of this also mimics the understanding of having an internal and external source of values and discipline. We've gone over how the human condition is a struggle between the true self and the body. Self-discipline, the kind of higher discipline that comes from within, is the result of a strong spirit of the true self conquering the body and subjugating it, denying its mere material craves and wants beyond those necessary to keep the body a functional tool. The other kind of discipline is enforced discipline from without. If the true self is not strong enough, an external force may come in and impose restrictions that are out of one's hands. Christianity, Islam, and all religions, i.e., exoteric spiritual teachings, are examples of an external set of rules. Morality is also one of those means to impose such order. On the social level, this is the totalitarian structure. Esoteric spiritual teachings, our worldview, as we have discussed before, internalizes values and allows you to make proactive choices. As a result, fascism through anarchy demands even higher standards, because it demands that everyone who become part of the natural restoration process be capable of self-discipline, of having their order and control originate from within. Otherwise, they are worthless and have to be babysat all the time. Thus, fascism through anarchy can be more radical and does not tolerate weakness. There is no place in the new growing organic state for the old generation of weaklings. Fascism through totalitarianism, however, does allow for the weak average commoner to be part of the fascist society, but he is constantly constrained by the system to make sure he does not in any way cause damage to the restorative process, that he follows the narrow line put in place. The totalitarian approach is aimed towards securing a new generation that was given the proper education, teachings, and understanding that they can carry on without the need for totalitarian control, and to keep the older generation from interfering with this process while also allowing for them to be part of the system. Once a new generation is raised and the old generation dies out, the totalitarian system may be dismantled. Junger's anarch once again comes to mind in this situation, and a new interpretation, one that is closer to the truth, of an anarch is to the anarchist what a monarch is to the monarchist, arises. The monarch is the source of external order imposed onto the monarchist. He needs the monarch to be his source of order. To the anarchist, in what is now a far departure from the common notion of what an anarchist is, the anarch is order internalized, the lack of imposition of order by an outside source, something to be emulated. Now, none of this, of course, means that this applies to everyone, as once again not all people are capable of self-discipline. These are the lower caste people who require the superior castes and the hierarchical structure to exist. We are not talking about how a fascist society is comprised entirely out of the superior people, but rather that the old generation is rooted in a worldview of falsehoods, whereas the new generation has to belong to the worldview of truth. What was said above is but an explanation of how fascists would operate to establish a fascist society by either of those two paths. So in the case of fascism through anarchy, you can still have the lesser caste people in the process of growing a new society, but their strength comes from accepting their place in it. In fascism through totalitarianism, you can have the lesser caste people, but not all of them are accepting of the truth, i.e., the old generation is still present in this system. Thus, to us fascists, anarchy and totalitarianism are means to an end, transitional states, much like how Marx believed in the need of socialism before you could achieve communism. To us fascists, we need to first create anarchy or totalitarianism before we can grow an organic society. The first allows for greater freedom of action, the latter is more merciful towards preserving some elements of our temporal past. And that's the end of that article. Final article, Utilitarian Morality by Zager. We've discussed previously how fascists should adhere to the notion that good ends justify any means. What we mean by this, of course, is that restoration of justice and the natural order is by definition good, and that methods aren't good or evil, they are only tools. Taking this one step further, we can agree that ethics can't be thought of as just a bunch of rules or even principles like the Golden Rule. All rules and principles are only a means to an end. So this being said, I must address a common mistake, which is to describe this understanding of morality as being utilitarian. Fascism is not utilitarian in any way, quite the contrary. Among the fools who call themselves philosophers these days, those who theorize about ethics are the most delusional. Utilitarianism is a theory produced by this crowd. Their analysis begins much like ours does, by realizing that moral rules are only a means to an end, and thus that true ethics is about those ends. But then they immediately go full retard by jumping to the conclusion that ethics is about minimizing pain and maximizing pleasure. They then proceed to proudly announce that they can scientifically and mathematically judge ethical concepts by applying economic analysis techniques to quantify pleasure and pain, as measured by monetary value and other statistical tools. This analysis is then used to preach about which policies are the most moral. Yawn. This completely misses the point, to the point of childishness. They assume from the start that the goal of life is to maximizing pleasure and avoiding pain, that all humans are of equal worth and consideration, and that material conditions are the only aspects of the human experience which has moral significance. I beg to disagree. Are pleasure and pain the final arbiters of good and evil? Is the life of a foreigner worth the same morally as that of your own blood relative? That of a thief the same as that of a saint? Are spiritual values to be cast aside for the benefit of more comfort and greater safety? If there is a hard question in ethics, it's to decide on what the goal of life is, not deciding how to accomplish it. Actual rules can be developed by a little bit of reflection combined with trial and error and common sense. Utilitarian morality is a purely modern and thus materialistic outlook on life, which is in complete opposition to the fascist worldview. A fascist lawmaker does not want to maximize utility value, comfort, and safety, but works to implement the natural or divine order in society. Fascist ethics is all about working to better understand this natural order and its implications in human affairs, as well as developing helpful rules and principles to guide the people towards it. This cannot be achieved through statistics, monetary analysis, or other mathematical contrivances, but only through meditation and research on the eternal principles of the universe. This would be abundantly clear if not for those dull souls who derive their moral standards from ancient books or outdated traditions, without having any understanding of the spirit behind those standards. "I don't steal because God said so in X book" is not a valid ethic. It's just being afraid of the one with the power to punish you, God in this case. A free man, a brave man, doesn't conform himself to a code out of fear of being punished. A fascist's internal compass, being based on the eternal order, will dictate his behavior even if eternal damnation is the consequence for acting justly. This is what we mean when we talk of storming the gates of heaven. Probably my favorite article of this chapter. That and the first one were real good. But this one especially. This is good. Good stuff. And that concludes this recording